Hello, dear friends. Today is Soldiers Memorial Day here in Israel. And so the study today will be Lili Nishmat for the scent of soul of all those who fell in Israel's battles, from the army, from police force, and all those who are protecting the state from our enemies. And may there be peace. Dear friends, I'd like to talk about Tazria Mitzora. About Aharei mot-Kedoshim, but it's actually connected to Tazria Mitzora, because there are 4 parashiyot here in Vayikra, and one leads up to the other. And then on Aharei mot-Kedoshim, I want to also explain the connection to the Haftorah, to what we read in the prophets on these days, and also the argument that went on this year, which I will explain as well. In my short video on Tazria Mitzora, the 2 parashiyot which talk about the biblical leprosy disease, which I mentioned is an unusual disease and not what we know today as Hansen's disease. I pointed out that this disease, which represents what I would call a certain decay or decadence within society on the individual level. And I brought the Tanchuma, the Midrash Tanchuma, which says that the biblical leprosy is brought about for 12 reasons. Usually we talk about gossiping, lashon hara, and slander, character assassination, but also ayin hara, the way you look at people, and avodah zarah, and idolatry, and things that have to do with thought and speech and relationship with others, which are the beginning of decadence of society. It starts with thought, continues with speech, and then eventually becomes to action as well. So this, now, usually before it comes to action, you don't see the outcome. But the point is the decadence in the society exists. And the biblical disease of tzarat, of leprosy, is a visualization of this decadence before it actually becomes manifest in this world. And that's why it does not exist today as a disease anymore. But for the sensitivity of those who lived in the biblical times, there was a way of perceiving this. And it was specifically the Kohen, the high priest, or the priest, who would be the mediator between God and man to remedy this malady of the tzarat, of the biblical leprosy. Remember, it's also the Kohanim, or the teachers. Kisifte kohen yishmeru dat v'torah yalamdu mipihu, as it says in the prophet Zechariah, because the lips of the Kohen teach knowledge, and Torah will come from their lips. And even the whole tribe of Levi, of the Levites, which the Kohens are a part of, Moses said about them, Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratcha liYisrael. It says in Deuteronomy, they shall teach your precepts to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. So it's the teachers who are able to remedy this decadence in society, which starts from the thought and the wrong speech. Now, after Tazria Mitzora, and this will explain, you have why there was this pause with Tazria Mitzora before we came to Aharei. Because at the beginning of Aharei Mot, it starts again with the issue of the death of the sons of Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, which happened in Parshat Shmini right before Tazria Mitzora. So as I said then, Tazria Mitzora represents a certain decadence in society related to the individual. And that's why the leprosy can happen on the body of the individual, on the hair, on the clothing, and even on the house. Because as individuals, we are responsible for ourselves, for our bodies, for ourselves, meaning our soul and our body, and what surrounds our body, and the clothes, and even our household, and even those who live in our household become our direct responsibility, our family unit. However, when it comes to the rest of society, there's only an indirect responsibility of the individual and the rest of society. because it's usually the leaders of the society who are the ones who are more responsible. The individual can have some influence, but it will be limited. So this is in Tazria Mitzorah. But then in Kedoshim, in Aharei Mot in Kedoshim, all of a sudden there's a changeover to the collective level. And I will go to the beginning of Aharei Mot and see what exactly it says. So the interesting thing is that Aharei Mot, which starts with the death of the sons of Aaron, then it talks about the high priest. Remember, it's also the same priest who comes and remedies the person from leprosy in Tazria Mitzorah. So now the priest, and specifically the high priest, comes on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, he has to atone not only for himself, because it says in chapter 16, verse 12, V'chiper ba'ado v'ad beito, he shall bring atonement for himself and for his home. But then it says further on, V'chiper ba'ado v'ad beito, he shall bring atonement for his household and for all Kahal Yisrael and for all the assembly of Israel. And it says so also at the end, that is V'chiper ba'ado v'ad kol ha'am, that he is also bringing atonement for the whole people. So that same Kohen who was involved in the leprosy, biblical leprosy for the individual in the home, now he's involved in atonement for the whole people, the whole assembly of Israel. And so Aharei Mot and Kedoshim are talking about things that are affecting the whole of society as a whole. And that's why we have, which of course has to do with idol worship. I've always said that idol worship is the beginning of moral decadence in society, because what is really idol worship? Those of us who believe in a one God, and the Bible, it says in the Bible, in the Torah, that God created mankind in his image. So therefore, we have godliness within us. We have this ability to mimic God, to do good, to choose good over evil, to live an ethical and spiritual life. And that's what the Torah says in Devarim to do. That's choosing life. But idolatry is creating God in man's image. So we become the boss. We decide the spiritual world. It's all about us. It's a certain unlimited arrogance, as if we control everything in a life that we don't even control, that we don't control the day of our birth, and we don't control the day of our death. And these are definitely major milestones in our existence. So if we don't control that, what do we control? Whatever's in between, that's where our free choice is. So the ultimate arrogance is the ultimate anthropocentric arrogance is idol worship, where we create God or gods in our own image, where we want to take over a world which is beyond our reach. So, and then it talks about, again in Aharei Mot, moral decadence in society, in relationship to people, and sexual decadence, and things that are going and walking and following the culture of the idol nations, idol worshiping nations around us. And then the motif starts off in the end of Aharei and at the end of Kedoshim. It says, chapter 18, verse 28, "V'lo taki etchem haaretz," so that the land shall not spit you out, shall not vomit you out, if you defile it, just like it vomited out the nation who was there before you, meaning the Canaanites. Because if you follow the abominations of these nations, the land will vomit you out. And therefore, watch my precepts, not to follow the abominations of those who were before you. Kedoshim 2, the parsha of Kedoshim, the portion of Kedoshim, which starts from chapter 19 in Vayikra and Leviticus, is talking about how to formulate a society, Actually, a lot of things here which are sort of similar to Parshat Mishpatim and Shmot in Exodus. There's also here mention of things that mimic the Ten Commandments. You can find them also here brought down Parsha in Midrash Tanchuma and the Ibn Ezra and others too, about how to create a society which is built on ethical, moral, and spiritual values. And then again, at the end of this parasha, you have this same idea. In chapter 20, verse 22, you shall keep these precepts and you shall do them, so that the land will not vomit you out, the land that I'm bringing you there to. And do not follow in the ways of the nations, which I am sending out before you, because I despise them. Because you will take over their land, and you inherit it, the land of milk and honey. But I have separated you from these nations, etc. And you shall be holy, for I, God, am holy. Verse 26. And I have separated you from these nations to be for me. So again, you have this motif. And the motif again is this idea of creating a society which is based on certain values, ethical and spiritual values, which makes us into a holy nation. Now, so we go therefore from the individual and the household to the collective, from Aharei to Kedoshim, as opposed to what was in Tazria Mitzvah. Now the Haftarot. What is the relation of the Haftarot of these two parashiyot? And what do you read? So the first Haftarah is called Haloki B'nei Kushim, which is Amos chapter 9. The Haftorah in Amos chapter 9. Now, both of these Haftorahs, which we read on these two parashiyot, relate to the motif I mentioned before, lest the land vomit you out if you go after the precepts of the nations, if you follow the culture of the nations, because that would be the punishment. And because of that, and since we had two major exiles out of the land of Israel, the first one being Babylonia, in 586 before the Common Era, where we spent 70 years in Babylonia after the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of Judea, because the northern kingdom was destroyed earlier than that in 722, before the Common Era. But then there was a second time we had Galut. We were exiled again by the Romans with the destruction of the second temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. And that is the exile that continued until 1948, until the state of Israel was set up again after 2,000 years of exile. So our haftarah of these two parashiyot relate to both. But they relate to both in the sense that, because remember, both of the haftarahs were written before the destruction of the second temple, because the prophets predate the second temple. Except for Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, only saw the beginning of the second. So therefore, the two exiles mentioned are the exile of the northern kingdom in 722 before the Common Era, and then eventually the exile of the kingdom of Judah in 70 of the Common Era. These are the two haftarot. So the haftarah of Amos basically talks about how, and Amos in general, in the 9 chapters of Amos, is talking about the pending possible exile of the northern tribes of Israel. The 10 northern tribes were called Ephraim, the northern kingdom, or sometimes Israel. And even in Amos, there's a hint of when it's going to happen. And that's Haftorah number 1. However, in Haftorah, it says that even though they'll be in exile, there's a positive side, because I shall rebuild the fallen sukkah, the fallen booth of David, and I shall rebuild its fence and rebuild it from its destruction. So, which means, Yeshavti Yeshvut Am Yisrael, So it talks about the fact that Judea will be saved, which is the house of David from the tribe of Judah. We also understand there's rebuilding of the temple eventually, but in this context, it also means that Judah will be saved. As the prophet says, Hosea, it's enough. Jacob has suffered enough. He's small. It says that God listened to him about this. And so God also says, I will never destroy completely. There'll always be something left. So Judah was what was left, and that continued, which is one of the reasons we're called Jews today. That's another discussion. And the second Haftorah, though, is from Ezekiel chapter 20, or according to the Ashkenazim, it's chapter 22, which is read sometimes in mot-Kedoshim, is talking about in the Babylonian exile, which is the exile after the fall of Judah. And even though it's talking about the abominations that were in Jerusalem, it's basically past tense because the destruction already took place. So these are the two Haftarot, and both of them have this idea of the motif that if you follow the precepts, everything will be fine. If not, the land can vomit you out. And so it's two examples, the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom. Remember, the exile after the Second Temple period did not exist at that time. Now, I want to say, though, there's an interesting discussion about the Haftorahs. Most of the time, we only read one of these two Haftorahs, which is Amos 9, which is slightly more positive in its ending note. That basically Israel will come back and everything will be rebuilt. Whereas the one on Ezekiel 22, even though it's theoretically in past tense, it sounds very negative. And so the question, and it's interesting though, that because Kedoshim, Aharei and Kedoshim very often are together, when they're together, we only read Amos 9. And even sometimes when they're not together, very often one of them falls either on New Moon, Rosh Chodesh, or the day before, which is another Haftorah. So, like the last time we read the Haftorah of Ezekiel 22 was 7 years ago. So the question this year in Jerusalem was whether to read it because we have the two separate parashiyot or not. And that's actually not a simple answer. Because why would we want to have a negative Haftorah? There was a negative Haftorah according to the Rambam, which was Ezekiel 20, which we read, the Sephardim read here. And that one actually was, I think 20 or 19, which was actually, it was called Hodat Yerushalayim Tovoteh. It was read in Parshat Shmot. But according to our tradition today, both according to the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, we don't read it anymore. So there we have an example of a Haftorah which was negative, and it was taken out. Talking about Jerusalem. Why should we talk about all this negativity? We figured it out. We know the problems. And it's the same question here. So I was told that it's Minhag Yerushalayim actually not to read the Haftorah of Ezekiel 22, and just to read Halo Kivnei Kushim of Amos 9 twice. And I'll show you also a certain passage in the Talmud which could support this. There's a passage in the Talmud in Megillah, lovely Megillah, about which Haftorahs are read and translated. And it says, the Ezekiel 16, that was the one that used to be on Shmot, it wasn't 20, but 16. Hodad Yerushalayim Tovoteh, you read it and you translate it into Aramaic. Lafukim mit Rabbi Eliezer, but this was against the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, because the Braita says there was a certain person who was reading this piece of the prophets just above Rabbi Eliezer. It was like a second story in a building. He read it aloud. Tell Jerusalem its abominations. Rabbi Eliezer heard that and was angry. He said, before you check the abominations of Jerusalem, maybe check the abominations within your own mother. They checked after and they found that there was a problem in the family. Now, and as I said, today we actually don't read that Haftorah for Parshat Shemot. But the question is, what's the difference between that and reading Ezekiel 22 on Parshat Kedoshim? So it makes sense why Ezekiel 22 was sort of sidelined. And it makes sense why the custom in Jerusalem never to read it, even on the rare occasion that it falls out as a separate Haftorah, we'll just do Kivnei Kushim twice. Why? Because we don't want to dwell on iniquities. We want to build. We want to reconstruct. We want to pave ways. And there's what Tibet said that, say of that. Maybe in other places they can, but definitely in Jerusalem and definitely times of war, it's time to think positive and how to rebuild. These are things that we are hoping that this war end in a good way and there be rebuilt here, new life, new visions, and new hope. Shalom, shalom.